Hi there, this is my commentary on Chapter 3 of Lila by Robert M. Pirsig. So Chapter 3 is interesting because presumably it lays out what is going to be the theme of the book. I had some difficulty interpreting this chapter because there doesn't appear to be a lot of hidden stuff in there. So let's think about Zen and the art of motorcycle maintenance for a minute. Zen and the art of motorcycle maintenance has a lot of fingers pointing to the moon. It is sort of showing you an example what the metaphysics of quality is. And while Pirsig spells things out in places, namely, for example, where he restructures his view of reality, and also Phaedrus's detective work at getting to the core of the problem in ancient Greece, for the most part, it's a lot of ways of showing you rather than telling you. In places in Lila, it's almost as if Phaedrus is delivering a lecture on the metaphysics of quality. And in an interview shortly after Lila was published, he said he wrote Lila partly, or in a large part, to explain in a more straightforward way what people said they could not understand, even after multiple readings of Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. And he was frustrated by this because he said he wished people could just read Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance once and understand it. So that's funny. Because certainly people had a difficult time with that. So the point is the chapter isn't hard to understand, and so I'm just going to use a lot of quotes in this particular commentary and sort of give it a synopsis of what the chapter is about with some interpretation, some thoughts, but not as much as I would ordinarily do, again, because it's so straightforward. So first of all, Vern Duesenberry, who was introduced at the end of chapter 2 on that card, which gave his reason and date of death, is a big part of this chapter. So Vern Duesenberry is a professor of English with Pirsig at Bozeman. Academically, he had long before been placed on the tough pile of scholars. Remember the tough cards? The tough pile of scholars, whom the department would just as soon have gotten rid of. Tenure was all that saved him from the junk pile. He had little to do with the rest of the department socially. Other members seemed to be in various degrees of alienation from him. So remember, Duesenberry was almost relegated to the junk pile in Phaedrus's system, but now he emerges in full force. But when Phaedrus had gotten to know him, Duesenberry was actually gabby in a high-spirited, gleeful, maiden-antish sort of way. It was a slightly gay style, tart and somewhat backbiting, and at first Phaedrus thought this was why they were so down on him. So this description of gay here is actually pretty apt, and I'm going to get in trouble for saying this, because if this was 1990 instead of 2020, I don't think this would be an offensive thing to say. It probably is an offensive thing to say, but nowadays. But I went to art school in New York City, and a lot of guys had this style, and they would have agreed with me, and they would have exaggerated it for laughs. It was sort of an art form. Nowadays, of course, you can't say that, so maybe I'll get in trouble. I don't know, but I think that it's sort of a description of a stereotypical style, and I think it's kind of respectful the way he presents it here. Now, it turns out that the staff of Bozeman didn't care whether Duesenberry was gay or not. It was the fact that he was very over-enthusiastic, let's just say, about the local Indians, and there's reservations around Bozeman. I don't know if there's more than one. Sorry, I should know that. Duesenberry is all about the Indians, particularly the Rocky Boy Indians, the Chippewa Cree on the Canadian border, about whom he was writing his PhD thesis in anthropology. So Duesenberry had little interest in teaching English, but he immersed himself in the world of these Indians at the local reservation, becoming much part of their world as is possible for someone who is not from their tribe. And this, of course, made him very eccentric to his colleagues, and they didn't trust him. But for Duesenberry, this was the only way to actually learn about the Indians. And it was the only way to do anthropology. Duesenberry didn't want to be an English professor. He wanted to be a doctor of anthropology. And certainly sitting back, observing, and taking notes for Duesenberry was not doing anthropology. The main part of his eccentricity seemed to be his refusal to accept objectivity as an anthropological criterion. He didn't think objectivity had any place in the proper conduct of anthropological study. This is like saying the Pope has no place in the Catholic Church. In American anthropology, that is the worst possible apostasy, and Duesenberry was quickly informed of it, so this is why they don't like him, one of the reasons. So this contrast in approaches of immersion versus objectivity is going to be an important element in this book. So because of this, subsequently no university would take him for his anthropology PhD, so he skirts around this problem by being admitted to Uppsala University in Sweden. But he fervently stands by his immersion approach. The trouble with the objective approach, Duesenberry said, is that you don't learn much that way. The only way to find out about Indians is to care for them and win their love and respect. Then they'll do almost anything for you. But if you don't do that, he would shake his head and his thoughts would go trailing off. I've seen these objective workers come on the reservations, he said, and get absolutely nowhere. So remember, in Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, there's a contrast between the ghost that the Indians believe in and the ghost of the Westerner, which is the ghost of Newton. And this gives some insight into an ongoing theme, which is the myth that the Western view of objectivity and rationality is somehow at the top of the hierarchy of all knowledge and understanding, and is the only true epistemology and ontology. I hope I got this right. I'm trying. So lately we've been talking about other ways of knowing, and these other ways fit in well with Pirsig. So Duesenberry engages with the Indians in participatory knowing. There's this pseudoscience myth that when you're objective, you just disappear from the face of the earth and see everything undistorted as it really is, like God from heaven. But that's rubbish. When a person's objective attitude is remote, he gets a sort of stony, distant look on his face. Another observation that I'm making is that objectivity can be a value trap. Sure, it's necessary sometimes to be objective, but it can keep you from understanding and engaging with the values of the people you're studying, say, or people you want to get to know even in real life. You know, are you looking at people objectively to be kind and fair, or are you looking at them objectively to keep a distance from them? That's worth thinking about. And since this participatory knowing is a way of seeing the world based on quality, on value, then it doesn't make sense to be scientific really about the ever-changing dynamics of a group of human beings in their particular social and cultural world, which is ultimately based on value. It's respectful, in fact, to engage with them in this way, in a participatory way, in a way that you are acting that you respect their culture and you want to know more about it. And Duesenberry indicates that if you just sit back and study them, they don't like it. Well, would you? Would you like it if someone, sat back and this has happened to teachers before? Isn't it nerve-wracking when people come and observe your classroom, let's just say? So with the objective anthropologies, the Indians, either Duesenberry says the Indians will tell them anything or they'll tell them a bunch of fairy tales, which of course a lot of anthros believe at first because they got it objectively. Some of these anthropologists make big names for themselves in their departments, Duesenberry said, because they know all that jargon. So that's why I'm not objective about the Indians, he said. I believe in them and they believe in me, and that makes all the difference. So what are the implications of not being objective, of immersing yourself in a culture? Well, it probably means, again, you have to act in a way that the culture can accept. You have to respect the rules of the culture, which means you have to adopt their values or at least follow the protocol that comes from those values. Duesenberry does that, and he becomes sort of their mascot and an honorary Indian, and he helps them out a lot. And of course, this means he has to keep some of the secrets and not use them in his work, but it's worth it to him. He still is coming out ahead, he feels. And Duesenberry, of course, is a misfit at Bozeman, so he connects with another misfit, and that, of course, is Phaedrus. Here, to Duesenberry's surprise, was someone who seemed even more alienated than he was. Someone who had done graduate work in Hindu philosophy of Benares, India, for God's sake, and knew something about cultural differences. Most important, Phaedrus seemed to have a very analytical mind. So that's important to Duesenberry because he doesn't. So he wants Phaedrus to help him with his work, which Phaedrus is sort of unable to do during his tenure there. So right before Phaedrus is about to leave for Bozeman for another job, Duesenberry suggests he come to a ceremony on the reservation. You're not going to convert me, Phaedrus said facetiously. Maybe, Duesenberry said. Duesenberry describes the ceremony, which ends with a ceremonial meal. And there's an amusing anecdote he shares about how he was expecting venison and blueberries at the meal, and instead they whip out a can opener and 3 cans of Del Monte. No, 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 not canned corn. And they laughed at me. They said, just like a white man, he has to have everything right. Rationality. Then after that, all night long, they did everything the way I said, and they thought it was even a bigger joke because now they weren't only using white man's corn, they were having a white man from the ceremony. And they were all laughing at me. They're always doing stuff like that. We just love each other. I just have the best time when I'm down there. And what better anthropology could you do than becoming one of them, so to speak? Duesenberry informs Phaedrus that they're going to be staying up all night, and this is going to involve seeking visions with a sacramental food called peyote. And at that time, which was about 1960, no one really knew about peyote. The anthropologists, or at least Westerners, didn't, or at least white Americans didn't. Only anthropologists really knew about it. Indians who used it regarded it as a quicker and surer way of arriving at the condition reached in the traditional vision quest, where an Indian goes out into isolation and fasts and prays and meditates for days in the darkness of a sealed lodge until the Great Spirit reveals itself to him and takes over his life. So there's an interesting observation he makes about hallucinogens, which makes sense because it shows how, in fact, that this experience is hyper-reality, that your day-to-day states of mind are influenced by a variety of factors, and you switch into different states of mind. But this switching, or these states of mind, or entering a state of mind, is really amplified by the hallucinogenic experience. The experience is determined by the person's mental state, the structure of his or her personality, the physical setting, and cultural influences. Makes sense. So as the hallucinogens grew in popularity in the upcoming decade, the 60s, they were deemed unsafe ultimately, and steps were taken to make peyote and other hallucinogens illegal. At one point, Duesenberry has to testify locally about hallucinogens. And he is encouraged to keep quiet about it because the university doesn't want any kind of controversy. And he really regrets this because he wants to be able to defend the use of this substance in Indian ceremony. The battle between hallucinogens and making them illegal, having them continue to be available and having them illegal, is framed as a public health issue, but it's really a moral issue. And it was also the persecution of a religious minority. And that is what Duesenberry objected to. The majority opposition to peyote reflected a cultural bias. This is the majority of Americans. This is in reaction to what the hippies were doing. The belief, unsupported by scientific or historical evidence, that hallucinatory experience is automatically bad. Since hallucinogens are a form of insanity, the term hallucinogen is clearly pejorative. Like early descriptions of Buddhism as a heathen religion and Islam as barbaric, it begs some metaphysical questions. Also, what is insanity is another theme explored in both books, and this sort of ties in with these metaphysical questions. And it is telling how our society feels about being out of control in this sense, out of line, by engaging in this kind of insanity. Now it's illegal, and it's interesting how we actually had to go through the whole clinical problem of PTSD after the Vietnam War and up until very recently to finally come to some kind of understanding as people really tried to fix very bad PTSD. We came to an understanding as to the utility of these vision quests, as to the utility of these molecules, as the science says, as these substances turn out to actually help people with major trauma disorders. But it's only through beginning to understand their therapeutic utility, which other cultures have known about for millennia, that we are beginning to find them even remotely acceptable. They are on the cusp of being made legal. In fact, psilocybin therapy was supposed to be legal last year, and of course there are a bunch of stumbling blocks. There's real resistance to this. And the only way we're even getting there is through objective study of science. But whatever it takes. So thank you, Johns Hopkins. And thank you, MAPS. I'm going to put some links below. And finally, thank you to Michael Pollan, who's really putting the icing on the cake and the pressure to make these molecules, these organic molecules, legal. The Indians who use it as part of their ceremony might with equal accuracy call it a de-hallucinogen, since it's their claim that it removes the hallucinations of contemporary life and reveals the reality buried beneath them. There's actually some scientific support for this Indian point of view. Experiments have shown that spiders fed LSD do not wander around doing purposeless things as one might expect a hallucinogen would cause them to do, but instead spin an abnormally perfect symmetrical web. That would support the de-hallucinogen thesis, but politics seldom depends on facts for its decisions. Boy, that should be etched in stone these days. So in trauma, the de-hallucinogen would be divesting you of the notion that trauma is your identity. With this hallucinatory experience, you get in touch with you get in touch with your true self underneath the trauma, and allow it to come back. And also, it allows the patient to be able to face and process the trauma. And this is probably the more important thing that happens. Is that you can face and process the trauma instead of it hiding in the background, instead of it being dissociated in the unconscious and then coming up and hijacking you every single time there's an unconscious trigger that reminds you of something that caused the trauma, because you've never properly integrated the trauma itself. You can't. It's so bad that you can't. In the worst case scenario, it's so bad you can't bring it into conscious memory, but it's in there and it hijacks you. So that is some of the mechanisms that are addressed with psychedelic therapeutics. The physical distance to that teepee, the teepee that the ceremony is going to occur in, from the highway was about 200 yards, but culturally the distance bridged with Duesenberry that night was more like thousands of years. Phaedrus couldn't have gone that distance without the peyote. He would have just sat there observing all this objectively like a well-trained anthropology student, but the peyote prevented that. He didn't observe, he participated, participatory, exactly as Duesenberry had intended he should do. So what the substance does is remove objectivity and immerse Phaedrus in the culture, and more than that, it immerses him into something much deeper. Let's just say that he enters the mythos of the Indian. Sometime after midnight, after he had listened to the singing and beating on the drum for hours and hours, something began to change. The exotic aspects began to fade. Instead of being an onlooker, feeling greater and greater distance from all this, his perceptions began to go in the opposite direction. He began to feel a warmth toward the songs. He murmured to John Woodenleg, the Indian sitting next to him, "John, that's a great song," and he meant it. John looked at him with surprise. Why should he feel at home? This was the last place on earth where he should feel that. He really didn't. Only part of him felt at home. The other part still felt estranged and analytic and watchful. It seemed as though he was splitting into two people, one of whom wanted to stay there forever and the other who wanted to leave immediately. The latter one he understood, but who was this first person? This first person was a mystery. So why does he feel at home? Stay tuned for a revelation, but let's go through the ceremony a little bit more. This wild side was saying for the first time, stop wandering, and these are your real people. And that is what he began to see there, listening to the songs and drums and staring into the fire. Something about these people seemed to say to this bad side of himself, we know exactly how you feel. We feel this way ourselves. The other side, the good analytic side, just watched, and before long it slowly began to spin an enormous web, symmetrical intellectual web, larger and more perfect than any it had ever spun before. The division here is not exactly the division that you saw in Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance between Phaedrus and Robert, but it's close. There's an odd parallel to it. One is the objective observer, Robert, who keeps at a distance and observes and says the right thing and keeps Phaedrus, the insane side, at bay. And then there's Phaedrus, who's a renegade, shaking everything up, stating that our mythos, which puts truth over value, has been wrong all along. Phaedrus is at home with the sophists, one could argue, and could be at home with the Indians and their values. But the division's a little different from that. We're going to see what that really is in a second. The nucleus of this intellectual web was the observation that when the Indians entered the teepee or went out or added logs or passed the ceremonial peyote or pipe or food, they just did these things. They don't go about doing them. They just did them. There was no waste motion. So there is a simplicity to this way, which is very much like Zen, just drawing water and chopping wood, just being spontaneous, just doing. They said what they wanted to say. Then they stopped. It wasn't just the way they pronounced the words, it was their attitude. Plain spoken, he thought. Plains spoken. They were speaking the language of the plains, both Indian and cowboy. Laconic, understated, very little tonal change, no change of expression. Yet there was a warmth beneath the surface you couldn't point to the source of. The web grew wider and wider. They were not imitating. If there's one thing these people didn't do, it was imitate. Everything was coming straight from the heart. That seemed to be the whole idea, to get things down to a point where everything is coming straight on, no direct, no imitation. But if they weren't imitating, why did they talk this way? Why were they imitating? Meaning, why were they imitating the white people? Why were they talking just like cowboys? Why were they imitating the white plains speech? Then the huge peyote illumination came. They were the originators. It expanded until he felt as though he had walked through the screen of a movie and for the first time watched the people who were projecting it from the other side. That's a great way to describe a paradigm shift. Beautiful. And what follows is a beautiful speech by a Comanche chief at a conference in Washington in 1867 where the reservations were being set up. And what the speech in Chapter 3 truly conveys is this way of speaking and understanding. It has a spare yet emotional, descriptive quality. It is certainly a speech where if you were to rank speeches in order of their quality, it would be at the top of the pile. And here's a little snippet from that speech. Any good thing you say to me shall not be forgotten. I shall carry it as near to my heart as my children, and it shall be as often on my tongue as the name of the Great Spirit. I want no blood on my land to stain the grass. I want it all clear and pure, and I wish it so, that all who go through among my people may find peace when they come in, and leave it when they go out. And Peter says, it was a damn sight better than cowboy speech, but it was still closer to the White Plains dialogue than is the language of the European. Here were the straight, head-on declarative sentences without the stylistic ornamentation of any kind, but with a poetic force. And as a little segue, the speech really resembles that speech of Hector the Hero from the Iliad, a speech that demonstrates arete. So let me read a little bit of that. Then you may live in Argos and work at the loom of another woman's house, or perhaps carry water for a woman of Messene or Hyperia, sore against your will, but hard compulsion will lie upon you. And then a man will say as he sees you weeping, this was the wife of Hector, who was the noblest in battle of the horse-taming Trojans, when they were fighting around Ilion. This is what they will say, and it will be fresh grief for you to fight against slavery bereft of a husband like that. But may I be dead, may the earth be heaped over my grave before I hear your cries and of the violence done to you. So it's kind of interesting how these speeches of this excellence, of this arete, are so similar, both stylistically and in content and in the way that reality is perceived. So, Phaedrus says, from that original perception of the Indians as the originators of the American style of speech had come an expansion. The Indians were the originators of the American style of life. The American personality is a mixture of European and Indian values. When you see this, you begin to see a lot of things that have never been explained before. Then Phaedrus talks about this scene at the very beginning of the movie Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, and I wanted to include this, but the one clip on YouTube has been taken down. So if I looked at Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid recently. It's really worth watching. You know, we got a few more weeks of this sequester, so that's a good movie recommendation. So look at the opening scene. It's done in sepia. It looks like an old photograph. The Sundance Kid is played by Robert Redford, who will figure into this book a little bit later. The voice of an unseen gambler says, "Well, it looks like you cleaned everybody out, fella. You haven't lost a hand since you got the deal." There's no change in the kid's expression. "What's the secret of your success?" the gambler's voice continued. It is threatening, ominous. Sundance looks down for a while as if thinking about it, then looks up unemotionally. "Prayer," he says. He doesn't mean it, but he doesn't say it sarcastically either. It's a statement poised on a knife edge of ambiguity. What Phaedrus wanted to do now was just use that one scene as an opening illustration. To it, he would add just one explanation, which no one ever notices, but he was sure was true. What you have seen, he would explain, is a rendition of the cultural style of the American Indian. So why is this film so compelling? This was a huge success in the 70s. The point of Phaedrus's thesis was that the reason it came naturally and that audiences responded to it naturally was that the film reached out into a root source of American feelings for what is good. It is this source of what is good, this historic cultural system of American values, which is Indian. So how about that as a revelation? So he proves this thesis by pointing out how an Indian resembles a cowboy and shares a description, an anthropological description of the Cheyenne male, who could just as easily be the Sundance Kid. During the Great Depression, people loved to go to Westerns, and they didn't have much money, but they certainly would spend their money to go to the movies and see these Westerns. They did so because those movies were a confirmation of the values they believed in. Those movies were rituals, almost religious rituals, for transmitting the cultural values of America to the young and reconfirming them in the old. It wasn't a deliberate, conscious process. People were just doing what they liked. It is only when one analyzes what they liked that one sees the assimilation of Indian values. So this is how what is in your boxcars, what is in the mythos, and the front edge of quality have a relationship. It's in enjoying and feeling the mythic presence of these characters in the film and feeling the archetypes within yourself, because this value system is in the American mythos. So then he gives some examples of these values. For example, during World War II, European military commanders rated the stability of American troops under fire as high, and that is also an Indian characteristic. Then there's our impatience in general with, say, flowery, manipulative speech. These well-mannered circumlocutions of aristocratic European speech are fork-tongued talk to the Indian and are infuriating. They violate his morality. He wants you to either speak from the heart or keep quiet. This has been a source of Indian-white conflict for centuries, and although the modern white American personality is a compromise of that conflict, the conflict still exists. Also, this anti-snobbery of all Americans, particularly Western Americans, is derived from this Indian attitude, and it's in our politics as well. The American politics of isolationism, in its refusal to become entangled in the meshes of European polities, come from this root, Phaedrus thought. Most of American isolationism has come from regions that are closest to the American Indian. You can see this conflict still in play in modern politics, where you have the academic, educated elite, more European, versus the people who seem more coming from the American frontier, the people who are on the more America First side, let's just say. So you see a little bit of that division, that Indian versus European division in what's going on politically. And Phaedrus says it's still with us and accounts for much of the restlessness and dissatisfaction found in America today. Within each American, these conflicting sets of values still clash. So you could argue that part of the problem around the meaning crisis, from the American point of view at least, is this conflict between proper European values and the newer, more nature-oriented, more let's just say, liberated frontier culture. And much of the discussion of the origin of the meaning crisis is in stale social values, and there needs to be an updating of these values. And we go back and forth with this. Both sides go back and forth with this. So I shouldn't say that the division is really, it's manifesting in that way now. But both sides politically have gone back and forth, with one side being more authoritarian, one side being more libertarian, let's just say. And now you could say that the right is a little bit more libertarian, a little bit more on the side of the Indians, and the left is a little bit more authoritarian, a little bit more on the side of the Europeans. So I think that that's what I was trying to say. So how is it that these Indian values entered the culture of the white pioneers? And this is interesting. The early frontiersmen, such as the mountain men, deliberately and enthusiastically imitated the Indians. Why wouldn't they? They had to. Remember Plymouth, you know, the Indians saved their asses. They were delighted to be told that they were indistinguishable from the Indians. Settlers who came later copied the mountain men's frontier style, but didn't see its source, or if they did, denied it and credited it to their own hard work and isolation. And here's where we see the true division that Phaedrus experiences perspectively in the ceremony. And there's been for the modern man a domicide, I think Vervaeke would say. With the conquering of the Indians, we're also conquering nature and the individual freedom that being in nature implies. But the clash between the European and Indian values still exists, and Phaedrus felt he himself was one of those in whom the battle was taking place. That was why he had the feeling of coming home at that peyote meeting. The division he'd felt within himself and thought was something wrong with himself was not within himself at all. What he was seeing was a source of himself that had never been formally acknowledged. It was a division with the entire American culture that he had projected upon himself. It was in many others too. So you see the division really isn't between Robert and Phaedrus, although there's some overlap and parallels. And when it's pointed out to you, you see this obvious division in two young men who are archetypes of these two sides of the American personality, which is Tom Sawyer and Huck Finn. This is in the chapter. So Tom is a New Englander, reasonably comfortable in polite society and prone to cleverness and manipulation, whereas Huck was a Western person, closer to the Indians, forever restless, unattached, unbelieving in the pompousness of society, wanting more than anything just to be free. Freedom, that was the topic that would drive home this whole understanding of the Indians. Of all the topics his slips on Indians covered, freedom was the most important. Of all the contributions America has made to the history of the world, the idea of freedom from a social hierarchy has been the greatest. It was fought for in the American Revolution and confirmed in the Civil War. To this day, it's still the most powerful, compelling ideal holding the whole nation together. Jean-Jacques Rousseau is sometimes credited with this idea of freedom from authoritarian hierarchy, but he got it from America. And in the speech by the Comanche chief, an eulogy to their freedom, which has been taken from them basically, so well exemplifies this. And Phaedrus says, he got it from the impact of the New World upon Europe and from contemplation of one particular kind of individual who lived in the New World, the person called the noble savage. The idea that all men are created equal is a gift to the world from the American Indian. And as Phaedrus' studies got deeper and deeper, he saw it was to this conflict between European and Indian values, between freedom and order, that his study should be directed. So this division, not between classic and romantic as in Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, although there's a certain degree of overlap there too, but between freedom and order is where Phaedrus' studies will go. So I hope that made sense, and I will see you next time.